After I identified myself, he turned to the car, which he proceeded to ransack. From under the floor mat, he pulled out a copy of the left wing weekly, The Guardian, which I had hidden immediately after the accident. I had slipped the letter to Dr. Moroka inside my shirt. He looked at the title and then held it up in the air like a pirate with his booty. He cried, "My word, we have caught a communist." Brandishing the newspaper, he hurried off. The sergeant returned after about 4 hours, accompanied by another officer. This sergeant, also an Afrikaner, was intent on doing his duty correctly. He said he would need to take measurements at the site of the accident for police records. I told the sergeant that it was not proper to take measurements at night when the accident had occurred in daylight. I added that I intended to spend the night in Thaba Nehu and that I could not afford to stay in Kronstadt. The sergeant eyed me impatiently and said, "What is your name?" "Mandela," I said. "No, the first one," he said. I told him. "Nelson," the sergeant said, as if we were talking to a boy. "I want to help you resume your journey. But if you are going to be difficult with me, I will have no alternative but to be difficult with you and lock you up for the night." That brought me down to earth and I consented to the measurements. I resumed my journey late that night, and the next morning I was traveling through the district of Excelsior when my car ground to a halt. I had run out of petrol. I walked to a nearby farmhouse and explained in English to an elderly white lady that I would like to buy some petrol. As she was closing the door, she said, "I don't have any petrol for you." I tramped 2 miles to the next farm and, chastened by my unsuccessful first effort, tried a different approach. I asked to see the farmer, and when he appeared, I assumed a humble demeanor. "My bus has run out of petrol." I said bus, the Afrikaner word for boss or master, signifies subservience. Friendly and helpful, the farmer was a relation of Prime Minister Strydom. Yet I believe he would have given me the petrol had I told him the truth and not used the hated word boss. The meeting with Dr. Moroka proved far less eventful than my journey there. He approved of the letter and I made my way back to Johannesburg without incident. The letter to the Prime Minister noted that the ANC had exhausted every constitutional means at our disposal to achieve our legitimate rights, and that we demanded the repeat of the six unjust laws by 29 February 1952, or else we would take extra constitutional action. Mellon's reply, signed by his private secretary, asserted that whites had an inherent right to take measures to preserve their own identity as a separate community, and ended with the threat that if we pursued our actions, the government would not hesitate to make full use of its machinery to quell any disturbances. We regarded Malan's curt dismissal of our demands as a declaration of war. We now had no alternative but to resort to civil disobedience, and we embarked in earnest on preparations for mass action. The recruitment and training of volunteers was one of the essential tasks of the campaign and would in large part be responsible for its success or failure. On 6 April, preliminary demonstrations took place in Johannesburg, Pretoria, Port Elizabeth, Durban and Cape Town. While Dr. Moroka addressed a crowd at Freedom Square in Johannesburg, I spoke to a group of potential volunteers at the Garment Workers Union. I explained to a group of several hundred Africans, Indians and Colorads that volunteering was a difficult and even dangerous duty, as the authorities would seek to intimidate, imprison, and perhaps attack the volunteers. No matter what the authorities did, the volunteers could not retaliate. Otherwise, they would undermine the value of the entire enterprise. They must respond to violence with non-violence. Discipline must be maintained at all costs. On 31st May, the executives of the ANC and the SAIC met in Port Elizabeth and announced that the Defiance campaign would begin on 26 June, the anniversary of the first National Day of Protest. They also created a National Action Committee to direct the campaign and a National Volunteer Board to recruit and train volunteers. I was appointed National Volunteer-in-Chief of the campaign and Chairman of both the Action Committee and the Volunteer Board. My responsibilities were to organize the campaign, coordinate the regional branches, canvass for volunteers and raise funds. We also discuss whether the campaign should follow the Gandhian principles of non-violence or what the Mahatma called Satyagraha, a non-violence that seeks to conquer through conversion. Some argued for non-violence on purely ethical grounds, saying it was morally superior to any other method. This idea was strongly affirmed by Manilal Gandhi, the Mahatma's son and the editor of the newspaper Indian Opinion, who was a prominent member of the SAIC. With his gentle demeanor, Gandhi seemed the very personification of non-violence, and he insisted that the campaign be run along identical lines so that to that of his fathers in India. Others said that we should approach this issue not from the point of view of principles but of tactics, and that we should employ the method demanded by the conditions. If a particular method or tactic enabled us to defeat the enemy, then it should be used. In this case, the state was far more powerful than we, and any attempts at violence by us would be devastatingly crushed. This made non-violence a practical necessity rather than an option. This was my view, and I saw non-violence on the Gandhian model not as an inviolable principle but as a tactic to be used as the situation demanded. The principle was not so important that the strategy should be used even when it was self-defeating, as Gandhi himself believed. I called for non-violent protest for as long as it was effective. This view prevailed, despite Manilal Gandhi's strong objections. The Joint Planning Council agreed upon an open-ended program of non-cooperation and non-violence. Two stages of defiance were proposed. In the first stage, a small number of well-trained volunteers would break selected laws in a handful of urban areas. They would enter proscribed areas without permits, use whites-only facilities such as toilets, whites-only railway compartments, waiting rooms, and post office entrances. They would deliberately remain in town after curfew. Each batch of defiers would have a leader who would inform the police in advance of the act of disobedience so that the arrest could take place with a minimum of disturbance. The second stage was envisioned as mass defiance, accompanied by strikes and industrial actions across the country. Prior to the inauguration of the Defiance campaign, a rally called the Day of the Volunteers was held in Durban on 22nd June. Chief Luthuli, President of the Natal ANC, and Dr. Naicker, President of the Natal Indian Congress, both spoke and committed themselves to the campaign. I had driven down to the day before and was the main speaker. About 10,000 people were in attendance, and I told the crowd that the Defiance campaign would be the most powerful action ever undertaken by the oppressed masses in South Africa. I had never addressed such a great crowd before, and it was an exhilarating experience. One cannot speak to a mass of people as one addresses an audience of 24. Yet I have always tried to take the same care to explain matters to great audiences as to small ones. I told the people that they would make history and focus the attention of the world on the racist policies of South Africa. I emphasized that unity among the black people, Africans, Coloureds, and Indians in South Africa had at last become a reality. All across the country, those who defied on 26 June did so with courage, enthusiasm, and a sense of history. The campaign began in the early morning hours in Port Elizabeth, where 33 defiers under the leadership of Raymond Maleba entered a railway station through a whites-only entrance and were arrested. They marched in singing freedom songs to the accompanying cheers of friends and family. In a call and response, the defiers and the crowd yelled, "Mefi Bouye Africa, let Africa come back." On the morning of the 26th, I was in the ANC office overseeing the day's demonstration. The Transvaal batch of volunteers was scheduled to go into action at midday at an African township near Boksburg, east of Johannesburg, led by the Reverend Nen B. Tensi. They were to court arrest by entering the township without permission. Reverend Tensi was an elderly fellow, a minister in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and the acting president of the Transvaal ANC. It was late morning, and as I was waiting for Reverend Tansey to arrive from Pretoria, he telephoned me at the office. With regret in his voice, he told me that his doctor advised him against defying and going to prison. I assured him that we would provide him with warm clothing and that he would spend only a night in jail. But to no avail. This was a grave disappointment, for Reverend Tansey was a distinguished figure and had been selected in order to show the authorities that we were not just a group of young rebel rousers.